friends, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Alicia, and here we talk all about cut flowers as I begin the journey of starting a cut flower business called Hilltop Blooms. So to beat the winter blues, we are in a series looking at how to plan out and prepare our gardens for the season. And so today we'll be looking at specifically the planning of layout. I'll show you what I'm doing for my garden and talk through how I calculate those things to hopefully help you guys plan your own gardens and get excited about everything that we'll have coming into the season. So if that sounds interesting to you, stay tuned as we jump into it. All right, so I have my computer here to walk you guys through what we have going on in our garden and talk a little bit about how I'm planning out where things go and how far apart they should be. I know spacing can sometimes be a little tricky to figure out. The spacing that's on seed packets is often not necessarily considering cut flowers for production. So if you're trying to grow flowers just for cutting and trying to optimize your space as much as possible, the numbers are a little different than what are often on seed packets. So gonna share with you what I have learned and kind of look through that together. All right, so pulling up the garden plan, as you can see, I'm definitely someone who likes to have everything planned out and coordinated. So this is organized down to the inch in my garden. So what we're growing this year, we have 4 3 feet by 18 foot beds, plus 1 2 feet by 18 foot bed kind of near my house. So what I did was I organized these just by inches. I'm using a software called Figma. You could really do this even in PowerPoint or anything that works for you. This is a software that I am familiar with using at work, and so it was really quick for me to mock this up in here. But what this allows me to do is think about how I have my beds spaced out, how the plants themselves are spaced out, and can kind of work through it together. So what you can see here is different sections of plants. So over here we have some statice and some zinnias in a bed. I also have some more zinnias in another bed over here. Might be a little odd to not put all of my zinnias together, but I did run into some powdery mildew last year, so I'm hoping to help just mitigate that by keeping some of them separate. All of these flowers, that are listed here, I mentioned in my previous video about everything I'll be growing this year, so feel free to check that out if you want a little bit more guidance. But ultimately, the way that I did this was use the different spacing for each individual flower and then made sure to give it enough room in the garden to figure out how to maximize what I had space for. So the way that I can do that, I'm going to change these so that you can see the actual spacing rings on them. Okay, so now that our spacing rings are coordinated, this probably looks crazy, but I'm gonna zoom in over to the sunflowers and we can look at a little bit more what's going on. So I am planning to grow my sunflowers at a 6-inch spacing. So you can grow sunflowers anywhere from 4 inches apart to 12 inches apart. And actually, especially with the single stem sunflowers, they will adjust based on their sizing. So I wanted blooms that were around 6 inches or so, growing them about that distance apart. And so what you can see is each plant has a center plant seedling, and then the spacing around it indicates how much space it needs. And so by doing this, I can make sure that each of my seedling plants has a 6-inch radius apart from every other plant. It gets a little crazy with some of the layering, but that is just what I'm using to do some of that spacing. Going across some other ones, these zinnias all have the same spacing. I've actually colored them just to help my brain think through what colors I'll have where. So with the Art Deco mix being more of a bright fuchsia, I have some yellow Isabellinas and then the Burnery whites, which are of course white. So our zinnias are using a 9-inch spacing. So what that allows in my 3-foot beds is rows of 4. I could do rows of 4 across, but I'm actually trying to use a grid instead of just rows. In this, I have 4 and then a row of 3, another row of 4, and a row of 3. So what that does is it just gets me 1 or 2 extra plants in the same space. Overall, what that ends up getting me is 77 zinnia seeds or zinnia plants in this space. So I have the numbers for each below. So I'm growing a little bit more of the Bernery white, 18 Isabellina, 14 Art Deco, 14 Will Rogers, and then 10 Queen Red Lime. So all of this is what the garden will start at, and then this helps me make sure I have space for those successions going forward. Status, I have that kind of magenta status, so we can fit 28 plants again at that 9-inch spacing. Some other 9-inchers across the garden are straw flower, so this will be 21 plants that will fit here, and then bachelor's button, which is around another 20 or so plants. You'll notice that there are some blank areas in my garden for sweet pea and bachelor button and larkspur, so that's where those plants are currently growing right now as they're overwintering, so I wanted to make sure that I had the space there for them. But the nice thing is that these plants will then be where I can succession plant my zinnias and some of those other things I want to see later in the season. Kind of going up in spacing, so things that need more space are our dahlias and the marigolds. These all need 12 inches of spacing at least. So you'll notice with both of them, I gave them a little bit more space than just 12 inches, but I just want to make sure that they have plenty of room to grow and branch out as needed. So I'll be growing 12 different dahlia plants and then 8 marigolds. Something else that I'm considering with how the garden is laid out is just the height of different plants. So while gomphrena aren't necessarily as tall as maybe my zinnias will get or the dahlias, they'll grow a little bit faster than the dahlias, and so they'll be able to have their own space. So trying to make sure, as I'm thinking about the sizing and spacing of things, that they have the right height to be growing, and then also keeping a little bit of a border or space between two separate groups of flowers. So as we get down into the really compact or tightly grouped flowers, we have Lisianthus and Cress. So both of those can be grown at 4 inches apart, and so we're gonna give that a shot and see how well it grows. So what is crazy about that is this Lisianthus, this is about, say, 3 feet by 3.5 feet, and I can fit 56 Lisianthus plants in here. Rather than doing that grid that I was doing with some of these other plants, it's gonna be a lot easier just to keep these at 4 inches apart in a really consistent spacing. So we'll be growing 2 types of Lisianthus here in the different groups, so hopefully those will grow throughout the season. And then here I have Cress. So that being one of the main greeneries I'm growing can fit about 112 here. So the plan is not to plant all 112 plants, but we'll be using this space throughout the season and kind of regrowing Cress in successions. With the sunflowers, I will also plan to succession plant them. So starting in the back and growing forward from right to left. So that way, as the plants grow, the earlier plants or the newer plants will still get that morning sun and sun throughout the day so that they're not being blocked out. So I'll be succession planting chunks of sunflowers throughout the season. So that's really the setup that I have going for my garden this year. So again, trying to make sure that each plant has enough space for the plant itself and the spacing that's needed for each given plant. So whether that's 4 inches, 6, 9, or 12, giving them enough space and making sure I know how much to grow in the garden. So going back to one of the other videos, I'm making sure that I have enough space for some of those focal flowers like sunflowers, dahlias, and zinnias, but trying to use the majority of the space for fillers and greenery and making sure I have that. Some of the things that'll be growing in another garden are basil, and our peonies will be planted somewhere else. I'll be growing lavender in another area. But for the dedicated beds for this growing, that's how we're breaking it up. And what this just helps me do is realize where I have space and can shift things around. So nothing is planted yet, so I can still mess with this and really understand where will be the best spacing for these things to make sure they don't shade one another out or impact the way another is growing, and to also see with my plan where those plants can then fit in as a second succession, or where the fall plants can replace a early spring crop to help make sure the garden is constantly being in use. Also, by keeping this, I can know where I planted specific varieties each year so that next year I can rotate that and make sure that the soil is getting new plants so that it doesn't get tired of just a specific type of plant. But something that's really crazy to me, guys, is the fact that with pretty much 5 beds that are 3 feet by 18 feet, a little bit shy of that, I'm going to be planting over 370 different plants. And that's not including what I have growing in the garden right now. That's not including the successions that we'll be planting. And that's fantastic. That's crazy to think that in such a small space, you can grow so many plants. If you just want to enjoy these plants and kind of grow them at leisure, you can definitely increase the spacing. Everything you heard me say is most likely smaller than what the recommendation will be on the seed packet. And everyone has different recommendations for spacing, but this is what I have heard from the research that I have done. And so I'm looking forward to kind of testing this out and seeing how it goes together. So that's the garden plan. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it is a good sneak peek into what we'll be getting into later in the season, and hopefully it helps start turning some gears to planning your own garden, whether that's big plots of land or just a few raised beds. There's so much you can do with space if you want to use it for this. So I would encourage you to measure things out, plan it out, and just use this as a fun time to explore and try new things and really understand what your garden could be. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe to follow along as we continue to plan our gardens for the 2023 season and get into growing some flowers. Thanks for joining this week, guys.